March 5, 2015, New York City. LaGuardia International Airport's runway 13 is now clear for Delta Airlines MD-88 to land. Because of the bad weather in the city, the pilots of this flight chose to land, which is very risky. The plane is heavy, the runway is short, and there is snow on it just before landing. Now there's no way to go wrong. If the pilots make a mistake, their plane could go off the runway and into Flushing Bay, which is very cold. What neither pilot knows is that severe weather, psychological issues, and the MD-88's unique design feature will make it almost impossible to land safely this morning. Look at this story about Delta Flight 1086. Delta Airlines Flight 1086 was getting ready to leave Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Atlanta early on March 5, 2015. Following a 2.5-hour journey, LaGuardia Airport in New York refused to accept it. There were 127 people, 3 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board. Not knowing it would be the last flight, they boarded the plane this morning. The plane was a McDonnell Douglas MD-88 that was 27 years old. Domestic routes heavily utilized the MD-88, a safe and dependable short to medium-haul plane. At that time, more than 100 MD-88s were in use, and more than 2,000 MD-88 pilots worked for the company. The plane had a stellar safety record, but this morning, its unique design feature, engines mounted in the rear, would prove fatal. The crew on this experienced plane knew what they were doing in the cockpit. 56-year-old Captain Theodore Lauer was in charge of the flight. He had been working for Delta since he became a pilot in 1989. Before that, he had been an instructor pilot and an F-16 pilot in the U.S. Air Force. At this point, he had logged more than 15,000 hours of flight time, with about 11,000 hours spent on MD-80 series aircraft. David Phillips, who was 46 years old, was the first officer. He had been working for Delta since 2007 and flew the 737 and MD-88. Before that, he was a flight engineer for another company on a 727. He was a pilot for the U.S. Navy before he became a commercial pilot. He was a U.S. Navy pilot. By this time, he had flown for about 11,000 hours, with about 3,000 of those hours spent on MD-80 series aircraft. Both pilots had perfect safety records, and their co-workers thought they were very skilled and adept at working as a team. It was 25 minutes after 9 a.m. Flight 1086 took off from Atlanta. For this part of the trip, the first officer flew the plane. The plane would be in New York's crowded airspace in 2 hours. As they flew to their normal height of 33,000 feet, the pilots talked about the weather in New York. They were increasingly worried about landing at LaGuardia due to East Coast snowstorms. These discussions persisted throughout the cruise, with the pilots asking American Airlines dispatch and air traffic controllers en route for weather updates. The stress caused by this uncertainty would significantly impact the outcome of the flight. At 10:30 in the morning, the pilots started to come down into New York. At LaGuardia, the weather was almost good enough to land. Because the weather was hazardous and the captain had more experience flying the MD-88, he decided to take over as pilot in command from the first officer. The pilots used landing distance charts to figure out how far the plane had to go to land. They considered factors such as the plane's weight, flap settings, wind speed and direction, and the runway's condition, including its coverage of snow, ice, or water. The captain learned that the plane would need adequate braking on the runway in order to stop before the end of the runway, even if he applied maximum braking when landing. If he did not do that, he could slide off the short runway and into the freezing water of Flushing Bay. It was only the runway brakes that determined whether to land. When an airplane lands, its braking action means its ability to slow down. The answer depends on whether snow, ice, or water are on the runway. The choice of braking action in this case is not objective. Instead, pilots who touch down on the runway give subjective reports on how well, moderately, or poorly following aircraft slowed down. The captain told the American Airlines dispatcher about this and asked if there were any reports of braking action. Unfortunately, the dispatcher failed to do so, given that the LaGuardia runway was in the process of clearing snow at that moment. Workers cleared the runway for 30 minutes, instructing all incoming flights, including Flight 1086, to enter holding patterns above New York. There was more and more stress in the cockpit. The captain told the first officer that he was upset that the dispatcher hadn't told them about the chance to hold. While the runway was swept, no planes would land, so there would be no break reports. The captain was worried that they would have to hold on for a long time. However, when an airplane landed in front of them, the brakes failed, forcing them to change course. If they could recall the functioning of the brakes prior to the runway sweeping, they could determine the feasibility of holding or diverting at that moment. The crew said they would slow down on landing. They would activate the max auto brake, the highest setting for the auto brake. When the plane lands on the runway, the auto brake is a system that stops the wheels automatically. The captain had to use the most powerful auto braking because the runway at LaGuardia was narrow and slippery. Usually, the captain would use a low or medium setting. The captain told the pilot that he had never used maximum manual braking before, not even in the simulator, so he decided not to do it. Maximum manual braking was even more powerful than the auto brake. At 10:45 in the morning, New York's air traffic control radioed another flight to let them know that LaGuardia's brakes were not working well. Flight 1080 SIX's crew heard this, and the captain told the first officer that they would not be able to land. But 3 minutes later, another plane landing at LaGuardia said its brakes worked well. The captain was still worried, though. The captain wanted to make sure that the reports of braking came from an airplane crew that was similar to his. This would give him a better idea of how his own plane was braking. United Airlines plane was an Airbus A320, which stopped similarly to the MD-80. The conditions were barely acceptable, but they were technically within the acceptable range. Air traffic control sent radar directions to Flight 1086 to align it with LaGuardia's runway 13. After speaking with the passengers, the captain instructed the flight attendants to secure everything in the galley, as they planned to apply the maximum auto brakes during the landing. The plane was on runway 13's instrument landing system in minutes, and the first officer called tower control. The crew was ready to go. Although it was not ideal, the runway did have some excellent visibility. The controller, on the other hand, produced winds that did not match what the captain could see on his instruments. His instruments showed that there was an 11-0 tailwind. If the plane touched down at 11 knots, the stopping distance would be longer. The stopping distances earlier in the flight did not account for a tailwind. He told the first officer to check the wind again with the controller. This was a crosswind, and the strength was just right. If it got stronger, the crew wouldn't be able. The captain said that everything was ready to go for landing. It has a gear, 40 flaps, spoilers, maximum motor brakes, and is armed. The pilots would aggressively slow down the aircraft. The pilots were ready to see the runway at any time. As they approached, they learned that the clearing of the runway was causing planes to remain in holding patterns. They thought there would be snow on the runway when they finally saw it. About 300 feet above the ground, the approach lights appeared through the snow, and the captain said that the approach would continue. Soon after, the pilots saw the runway, but it wasn't what they were expecting. Rather than encountering a paved runway with a dusting of snow, they discovered a runway completely blanketed in snow. This would significantly increase the distance for the plane to stop. In order to get the plane to land earlier on the runway, the captain lowered the nose a little. As soon as the plane touched down, the captain turned his full attention to stopping it. He immediately used the engine's thruster to change the direction of the air coming out of the front of the engine. The wings spread out spoilers, which pushed the main gear onto the runway and allowed the wheel brakes to work. However, within seconds, the plane began to yaw to the left. The captain tried to turn the plane around by stepping on the right rotor, but it kept going off course to the left. The thruster's ability to shoot air out of it made the rotor completely useless. When the first officer saw this, he yelled, "Get out of reverse! Get out of reverse!" The captain stowed the reversers and stepped hard on the right brake and rotor, but it was too late. The plane went off the runway, passed through the airport fence, and hit a hillside near Flushing Bay. The left fuel tank broke, letting fuel leak out. The plane hit the wall and bounced off for a few hundred meters before stopping with its nose on top of the cliff and facing the bay. The berm kept the plane and its people out of Flushing Bay's cold water. The air traffic controller didn't know the plane had crashed, though, because it was snowing so hard. He instructed the next plane to land while simultaneously making multiple calls to Flight 1086. However, it didn't work. The collision with the wall tripped the plane's electrical systems, rendering the radios and public address system inoperable. The tower didn't know about the accident until a snow-clearing vehicle came across the plane. Perhaps the most peculiar aspect of this entire situation was the length of time it took to evacuate. It took 6 minutes after the plane had landed for the captain to give the order to evacuate. When he didn't make it clear that it was important, so the evacuation didn't start for another 6 minutes. It should have only taken 90 seconds, but it did take 5 minutes to finish. Fortunately, the crash did not result in a fire, and all 127 passengers and 5 crew members survived, albeit with minor injuries. The damage to the plane was too severe to repair, leading to its write-off. Soon after the accident, the National Transportation Safety Board sent investigators to the scene to try to figure out what happened. The final report on the accident revealed that the captain's excessive use of reverse thrust disrupted the airflow over the rudder, a phenomenon known as rudder blanking, leading to an irreversible loss of direction control. People have known for decades that the MD-80 series of planes suffer from a problem known as rudder blanking, and they explicitly instructed all pilots of this type not to use excessive reverse thrust during landing, particularly on wet or icy runways. Why didn't this captain use what he had learned? Investigators found that the captain's worry about being able to land on the runway during the approach had made him tense, which is why he put stopping the plane ahead of everything else. So, as soon as the plane touched down, he turned on the reverse thrust much more quickly and with a lot more power than Delta Airlines recommended. He was determined to prevent the plane from slipping off the snow-covered runway, a fact he had recently discovered. On dry runways, planes should have the EPR set to 1.6 for reverse thrust. EPR, an acronym for engine pressure ratio, suggests that the maximum EPR for wet runways should be 1.3. This is what Flight 1080 SIX's captain should have done, but he pushed the thrust reverse levers strongly to EPR settings of 2.07 on the left engine and 1.91 on the right engine because he felt rushed to get the plane stopped on this short, snowy runway. This stopped the rotor from working at all during landing, meaning that the plane could no longer control its direction. Additionally, the mistake of setting the left engine to a stronger reverse thrust setting 2.07 versus 1.91 on the right engine led to the plane yawing to the left. This, along with the uneven runway surface and changing wind directions, caused the plane to depart the runway to the left. The NTSB found something troubling while they were investigating. It wasn't necessary for the captain to use too much reverse thrust on this flight, even though airlines teach pilots not to do that, and it's standard practice. The NTSB discovered that MD-88 pilots exceeded recommended EPR settings on both wet and dry runways. Simply put, the captain crashed the plane because he turned the engines into reverse thrust so quickly and set the EPR so high. Attentional tunneling is a psychological phenomenon that investigators found to explain why the captain didn't notice the mistake and stole the thrust reversers. When the first officer instructed the captain to stop the reverse thrust due to the left yaw, it is likely that the captain was experiencing attentional tunneling. This phenomenon occurs when individuals experience high levels of stress, causing them to concentrate on important or potentially dangerous primary cues while neglecting potentially important peripheral information. During the accident, the captain admitted in interviews that he couldn't monitor the EPR gauges due to numerous distractions during a landing. Because he thought the auto brakes weren't working, he checked the spoiler handle. The plane kept sliding to the left, even though he tried to steer it away from the snowbanks along the runway. Too much crucial information was flowing to the captain too quickly for him to realize he had exceeded the recommended values for reverse thrust EPR. Because of what they found, The NTSB suggested that airlines that fly MD-80 series planes change their operational procedures so that one pilot alerts the other when reverse thrust power goes over 1.3 EPR while landing on dirty runways. The NTSB also recommended that Boeing, the FAA, and the airlines conduct a study to examine reverse thrust EPR data, procedures, and training, and identify industry-wide best practices that consistently prevent EPR exceedances and reduce the risk of rotor banking. These people even suggested that Boeing look into adding an alert to MD-80 series planes to help pilots avoid EPR overages while landing. It is still the most common type of accident in commercial aviation today. It is called a runway excursion. We've learned from this accident that the phase-out of MD-80 series planes in favor of planes with engines on the wings is significantly reducing the frequency of accidents like this. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel.